As humans, we seem to have a natural tendency to want to explain how we got here, where we came from, and who our ancestors were. In ancient times, religions arose as a way of explaining how we were created, be that through a single omnipotent God or through an array of various gods, collaborating together to form us and the universe. While religion, of course, continued to persist for millennia through to this very day, roughly 200 years ago we began to find a more secular explanation for our current being science, specifically anthropological science. Darwin's theory of evolution, as published in The Origin of Species in 1859, combined with the various archaeological expeditions conducted in Africa and Europe throughout the 19th century, began to definitively shed light on the beginnings of the human race. Rather than coming from a god, we finally began to discover that we had instead inherited various traits and evolved from various primitive hominids over an extremely long period of time. One especially crucial hominid in this chain of evolution leading up to our species is undoubtedly Australopithecus africanus. This Australopithecine's discovery nearly 100 years ago provided an invaluable link in the long chain of hominid evolution that eventually culminated in our species. Australopithecus africanus, while likely a more ape-like creature than later hominids such as Neanderthals, nonetheless exhibited many of the foundational characteristics of our species. This has provided strong support for the theory that our ancestors ultimately originated from Africa and spread throughout the world from there as a sort of millions of years long diaspora called the out of Africa model, seen as how Australopithecus africanus is millions of years old itself. Thus, it is crucial to further study this species and all of the ways in which it exhibits characteristics similar and dissimilar to our own, so as to more accurately chart our evolution as a species. Human life can be significantly better understood by closely examining Australopithecus africanus's environment, morphology, diet and location, behavioral traits, and place within hominid evolution. Australopithecus africanus likely lived exclusively in South Africa from between 3.67 and 2 million years ago, from the middle Pliocene to the early Pleistocene. This fact was first established with the discovery of the Tongue Child in 1924, an Australopithecus africanus fossil that spurred scientists to eventually accept that human hominids were present in Africa. The environment that Australopithecus africanus likely lived in featured grasslands and larger open fields that encouraged hunting and favored the species' bipedal nature. Scientists have reconstructed the woodland habitats that Australopithecus africanus also likely lived in, so as to gain a better understanding of what living in these areas over 2 million years ago may have been like. This was able to be done as a result of the various fauna that have been found near Australopithecus africanus fossils, which scientists have used to estimate the makeup of such a habitat and construct what it may have been like. The Based on the animals that typically lived there and the types of habitats they typically lived in. One such reconstructed habitat is the Spot Valley in South Africa, circa 3 million years ago. The remade habitat is subtropical in nature, with the high rainfall in this area likely being conducive to the creation of a forest environment rather than an open grassland or savanna one. As mentioned before, Australopithecus africanus was more adapted to an open plains environment than a forest one, but the curved phalanges in its hands that are significantly more adapted to climbing than modern human hand bones still allowed it to prosper in forested areas. It is worth noting that later species of hominids, and even later examples of Australopithecus africanus itself, are typically found in less forested environments, once again reinforcing that our ancestors' slow evolutionary shift away from arboreal habitats and onto the ground likely took millions of years. Many of Australopithecus africanus' fossils have been discovered at the so-called Cradle of Humankind, an UNESCO World Heritage Site in South Africa whose Sterkfontein cave system has produced a bountiful supply of these fossils for scientists to study. While many details are still unknown about the habitats occupied by Australopithecus africanus, it is through the research being conducted at the Sterkfontein site and others like it that it has allowed answers to be yielded and will continue to do so for the years to come for these questions. The morphological traits that define Australopithecus africanus and distinguish it from both earlier and later hominids as well as our own species are as intriguing as they are numerous. Compared to the earlier Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus features a larger cranium with additional brain volume and smaller teeth, thus marking it as a step closer to current humans evolutionarily. One immediately noticeable difference in the skull morphology of Australopithecus africanus compared to current humans is the hominid's sloped, ape-like face with an extended lower jaw. Moving below the cranium, Australopithecus africanus of course features the pelvis, femur, and foot bone structure one would typically expect of a bipedal creature, further cementing its place in our lineage. Recent analyses of these structures have determined that Australopithecus africanus likely walked with an extremely similar gait to humans, while nonetheless retaining some hybrid evolutionary structures in its leg and feet bones that are a cross between those found in humans and chimps. The hind limb structures in Australopithecus africanus in particular differ significantly from those in humans, demonstrating that Australopithecus was still not terribly far along in its evolution relative to its sister genus Homo today. Other bone structures in Australopithecus africanus, specifically its shoulder and pan bones, once again indicate that the species was also adapted to climbing and verticality. As for other similarities to Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus is still rather small-bodied in comparison to later species in the genus Homo, having a rather small chest in particular. Another previously mentioned overlapping trait is of course how Australopithecus africanus features curved phalanges, likely enabling it to scale trees should it so choose. This was likely a useful attribute due to the aforementioned forests that Australopithecus africanus partially inhabited in South Africa. Another possible explanation is that Australopithecus africanus simply didn't evolve enough for it to shed this more primate-like feature yet at that point in our species' ancestry. The diet and locomotive traits of Australopithecus africanus offer key insights into how this primate managed to survive and proliferate given the undoubtedly harsh conditions it was subjected to in the South African grasslands of the time. Australopithecus africanus is currently accepted to have likely eaten a diet similar to modern chimpanzees, consisting of fruit, eggs, and nuts. It is even thought to have been preyed upon and eaten by other animals. This is in stark contrast to how anthropologists generally thought of the species as more carnivorous up until only roughly 40 years ago, as the piles of animal bones that were typically found with Australopithecus africanus fossils led scientists to assume this. Instead, it is now recognized that other predators, such as leopards, were likely responsible for leaving those remains. Additionally, newer research, while still rather hazy, has uncovered that Australopithecus africanus likely fed on breast milk for the first year or so of its life, and that it experienced lifelong issues with dietary stress due to variable resource availability. All of this research and knowledge has been gleaned by analyzing the teeth of Australopithecus africanus fossils, whose size and wear can provide a good indicator of an animal's dietary habits. Carbon isotope analysis has also indicated that Australopithecus africanus ate multiple carbon-13 laced foods as well, such as grasses and sedges. This evidence also feeds into the previous theory that Australopithecus africanus likely traveled across open woodlands and grasslands in search of nourishment, as these environments are rich in these types of grasses. Of course, the bipedal nature of Australopithecus africanus was necessary in order for it to accomplish this transition away from the tree-bound life of its ancestors. Recent analyses of the pelvic bones of Australopithecus africanus have found that they display structures extremely similar to those found in modern-day humans, despite being incredibly ancient for their age. While there is still more to be known about the diet and locomotive traits of Australopithecus africanus, those that have been discovered thus far paint an early evolutionary link to our current species bipedalism and a rejection of arboreal travel. The behavioral traits of Australopithecus africanus can only be roughly approximated due to the species' ancient age, but anthropologists do have a general idea of how this hominid must have interacted with the world. A great divider among hominids is their ability to use tools for hunting and crafting, and due to the fact that no tools have ever been found alongside Australopithecus africanus fossils, anthropologists have traditionally believed that the species must have never used them. However, there is emerging scientific evidence that somewhat contradicts this claim, as more recent analyses of the bone structures in the hand fossils of Australopithecus africanus seem to be incredibly consistent with a type of strong grip needed to wield and craft tools. Despite this newer evidence, scientists still posit that Australopithecus africanus was likely not a hunter, and that it instead ate a diet primarily consisting of fruits, plants, and seeds, as stated previously. A significant reason for scientists' continued insistence that Australopithecus africanus ate a soft rather than hard food diet is because its fossils do not feature sagittal crests, which are crests along the midline of skulls where chewing muscles are meant to attach. Another significant behavioral trait of Australopithecus africanus was likely a gendered one. Through analyzing the teeth enamel on collected fossils, researchers were able to determine that male Australopithecus africanus specimens tended to remain closer to home, while female specimens tended to leave home after puberty to join other groups. Since sexual dimorphism was present in these groups, the researchers were able to determine that fossils with smaller teeth were likely female, thus allowing them to discover this gender divide. The reason this behavioral divide existed is still being investigated, but its presence suggests that Australopithecus africanus society was likely more complex than many might imagine. Perhaps Australopithecus africanus society was more polyamorous in nature, with females being expected to go out and mate with multiple males, in contrast to many polyamorous social structures in the animal kingdom today. Further findings and investigations shall undoubtedly shed more light on the still ambiguous behavioral traits of the species. Australopithecus africanus' place in human evolution is absolutely crucial to understanding the foundational traits that would come to define our later ancestors and current species. As already mentioned, Australopithecus africanus' traits are quite similar to another older species, Australopithecus afarensis, and it is believed that the two species are close relatives. Despite generally being accepted as having played a key role in the evolution of Homo, seeing as how the genus Australopithecus has close evolutionary ties to Homo, there is still ongoing debate over the exact lineage of Australopithecus africanus, with some anthropologists positing that the species is instead more related to the genus Paranthropus. Another complicating factor driving this debate is that the famous town child, Sterkfontein member 4, and Menkes spot Australopithecus africanus fossils are all quite variable morphologically, despite all being considered to be members of the species, thus leading other anthropologists to presume that the taxon the creature is part of is simply highly variable. This all makes determining the descendants of Australopithecus africanus extremely difficult, as the species' age and variable traits make it simply too difficult to directly link to the hominid to a newer species. Rather, it almost seems as though Australopithecus africanus's traits are exhibited in many later examples of Homo. For example, its frontal bone within its forehead, seen above, is taller than its comparable evolutionary brethren of Australopiths and Paranthropus. Australopithecus africanus's occipital bone, found in the back of one's skull, is longer and flattened on the bottom compared to those same species as well. Its occipital bone's higher point of directional change near its very top makes Australopithecus africanus's skull significantly more rounded than one might expect. In this way, Australopithecus africanus is able to distinguish itself as a very unique entry in our ancestral past, while still bearing many of the same traits that would become honed and standardized in the genus Homo as it evolved. While the exact placement of Australopithecus africanus in our lineage is still rather hazy and ambiguous, the species is undoubtedly some sort of crucial ancestor to our own in terms of setting the groundwork for Homo's sharp shift away from the trees and onto the ground, so as to be strictly bipedal in nature. Much can be learned about our origins and evolution as a species from the fossil records of Australopithecus africanus. By extensively studying this hominid, we shine a brighter light onto our species' past and evolutionary path that brought us to where we are today. Traits in humans that would otherwise be essentially unexplainable through believing in creationism are explained by taking an evolutionary approach to our current existence. For example, a trait such as our tailbones that has essentially no use and would not be able to be explained as some necessary trait given to us by a creator is completely explained by the theory that we evolved and descended from ancient primates. In the same way, Australopithecus africanus provides an integral evolutionary link to older species of Australopithecus and Homo that we may trace our lineage to. By doing this, we may not only learn of our past, but become better able to project what our species will evolve into in the future. Perhaps we will eventually shed seemingly pointless organs and other anatomical features, such as the appendix, tailbone, and the like, to further hone our species. At the same time, perhaps development of new technologies and our rapidly changing environment may complicate our ability to project how exactly we may evolve in the future. With technologies such as CRISPR and other gene editing programs on the horizon as the next stage of human development, perhaps we really will be able to play God, so to speak, and modify ourselves with further enhancements, thereby bypassing evolution entirely. The coming and in many ways already present climate crisis is undoubtedly going to play a huge factor in how we may develop later as well, seeing as how our race will need to adapt to a warmer world with higher sea levels and greater amounts of disease than we had to live with in modern times. There is much unpredictability in the near future for our species, and we must best research our ancestors, the environment, and burgeoning technologies so as to better prepare for it and ensure our survival.